call button light stayed on for 40 minutes. I know because I counted. I sat in the hard vinyl chair beside my mother's bed at St. Auburn Regional and watched that small orange bulb glow above her door. And every time a nurse walked past without stopping, my mother's hand would drift back down to the sheet, defeated. My name is Dana Whitfield. I'm 34. I manage payroll and benefits for a mid-sized logistics company outside Columbus, Ohio. And for most of my life, I believed that if you were polite enough and patient enough, people would eventually treat you the way you treated them. That belief died in that hospital room. What most people never understood about my mother, what the nurse who ignored her didn't know, what even my own brother pretended not to know, was who she had been before the illness folded her into that bed. That gap between what people assumed and what was actually true is the whole story. Let me tell it in order, because the order is what makes it hurt and what makes it right. My mother's name is Ruth Ellen Whitfield. To the staff on the 4th floor, she was room 412, bed A, a 71-year-old woman with heart failure and a hard time swallowing. Quiet, undemanding, easy to skip. That's the thing about undemanding people. The world learns it can skip them. I want to be fair, because being unfair is exactly what I'm angry at. Hospitals are understaffed, nurses are exhausted, I have friends who are nurses and I know the shifts they pull, and the impossible math of caring for 6 patients at once. I am not telling you this story to burn down a profession. I'm telling it because one specific person made one specific choice about my mother, and then something happened that none of us saw coming, least of all her. Let me back up. My mother raised my brother Cole and me mostly alone. Our father left when I was 9 and Cole was 6, and after that there was just Ruth, working, always working. But here's the part people got wrong. They looked at the tired woman in the bed and assumed a tired life. My mother had not lived a tired life. For 26 years, she was the head of nursing education at that very hospital system. St. Auburn Regional was one of 4 hospitals in the network she helped build training programs for. She wrote the orientation curriculum that half the nurses on that floor had gone through. She had sat on hiring committees, she had disciplined staff, she had, in her own quiet way, been one of the most respected people in that entire building. She retired 8 years ago. Institutions have short memories. New administrators came in, old faces left, and the woman who had shaped a generation of nurses became, to the people now caring for her, just another slow old lady in a gown who pressed her button too much. She never mentioned it. That was Ruth. When I asked her once, early in the admission, whether she wanted me to remind the charge nurse who she was, she gave me this look patient, a little amused, the look she used to give me when I was 14 and certain about something I knew nothing about. And she said, "Dana, I don't want to be treated well because of who I was. I want to be treated well because I'm a person in a bed." And then, quieter, if they only do it because they're afraid of me, that's not care. That's performance. I thought about that sentence for a long time afterward. I still do. So we didn't say anything. And for the first week it was fine. Ordinary. The nurses were busy, but decent. There was a day nurse named Priya who was genuinely kind, who talked to my mother like she was a whole human being with a history, who once spent 10 minutes just letting Ruth tell her about the garden she used to keep. My mother lit up for Priya. I will always be grateful to Priya. Then the schedule shifted and we got Ren. I'm not going to pretend I understood Ren at first. She was maybe 28, competent looking, brisk. On paper, she probably looked great. She charted on time, she hit her marks. But there was a coldness to her that I noticed on day 1 and talked myself out of, because I am, God help me, a person who talks herself out of things. She'd come in, take vitals without a word of greeting, and leave. When my mother asked a question, Ren answered the wall, not the woman. When my mother said thank you, and my mother always said thank you, Ren was already gone. I told myself she was just tired. I told myself not everyone is warm. I told myself a lot of things. Because the alternative was confrontation, and I have spent my whole life avoiding confrontation like it was a live wire. The night everything changed was a Thursday. I remember because I'd taken a half day and stayed late, and I was supposed to leave by 9 to get home to my daughter, Sophie, who's 8. But my mother had been more confused than usual that evening, and I didn't want to go. Around 8:40, Ruth started having trouble breathing. Not dramatically. My mother never did anything dramatically. But her breaths got short and shallow, and she had this look I'd learned to read her looks a tightening around the eyes. She pressed the call button. I saw her thumb press it. The orange light came on above the door. We waited. At first I wasn't worried. Nurses are busy. 5 minutes. 10. My mother's breathing was getting worse. Not catastrophically, but enough that she reached for my hand, and my mother was not a hand reacher. 15 minutes. I got up and stood in the doorway and looked down the hall. I could see the nurse's station. I could see Ran at it, sitting, scrolling something on the computer. Another nurse beside her. The two of them talking in low voices, occasionally laughing. The call light was right there on the panel above them. I know it was because I could see the reflection of it. I did the thing you're supposed to do. I walked down and said, "Excuse me, my mother's having trouble breathing, room 412. Ren didn't look up right away. When she did, her face did this thing, this small, tired, put-upon thing, and she said, "Okay, I'll be there in a minute." And then she turned back to the screen. I want you to sit with that in a minute, because I did. I walked back to the room and I sat with my dying mother and I counted. And it was another 22 minutes before anyone came. And when someone finally did, it wasn't even Ren. It was a young aide who took one look at my mother's oxygen numbers and went white and hit the wall button for real help. My mother did not die that night. I need to say that clearly because the title of a person's grief shouldn't be a lie. She stabilized. They moved her to a monitored bed. A doctor came, kind and rushed, and adjusted her medications. And by 2 a.m, she was sleeping, and I was standing in the parking garage shaking so hard I couldn't get my key in the car door. But something in me had broken loose. Not rage, exactly. Something colder and clearer. Because in those 40 minutes sitting in that chair, I had watched my mother, the woman who taught hundreds of nurses that a call light is a person asking for help, that you never ever let it become background noise, get treated as background noise. In the building she helped build. Let me tell you about the next morning, because the next morning is where I made my first mistake. I went to the charge nurse, a woman named Delia, and I told her what happened, calmly, too calmly. I have this habit where the angrier I am, the softer I get, and softness gets ignored. Delia was sympathetic in that professional way that means nothing will happen. She said she'd look into it. She said the floor had been extremely short-staffed. She said, sometimes call lights get missed. It's not personal. Not personal? I almost laughed. Here's my mistake. I let it go. For a whole day, I let it go because I didn't want to be difficult, because Sophie had a school thing, because my brother Cole told me on the phone that I was making it a bigger deal than it was, and that Mom's fine. Dana, she's fine. Why do you always have to escalate? Cole. I have to tell you about Cole, because Cole is half of why I stayed quiet my whole life. My brother is 31 and he has spent his adulthood being rescued. By our mother, mostly. Money for a car, money for a deposit, money when his business idea folded, and then again when the second one folded. Ruth never said no to Cole, and I, being the older one, the responsible one, learned early that my role was to need nothing, so that there'd be enough left over for the one who needed everything. I told myself I didn't mind. I minded so much it had shaped the entire architecture of my personality. Cole didn't come to the hospital much. He'd visit for 20 minutes, be charming, make Mom laugh, and leave before anything got hard. When I told him about the call button, his instinct wasn't outrage. It was management. Manage Dana, keep the peace. Don't make waves that might somehow splash on him. So I let it go. For a day. And then I found the notebook. My mother kept a notebook by her bed, one of those cheap spiral ones, and I'd assumed it was for crossword puzzles because she loved crosswords. But when I picked it up that Saturday to bring her reading glasses, it fell open, and it wasn't crosswords. It was a log. In my mother's careful, shaky handwriting, she'd been keeping track. Dates, times. Press button 610, answered 6:55. Asked for water 3 times, given its shift change. Nurse W did not respond to light. Aide came. Page after page, my mother, the nursing educator, doing the one thing she knew how to do even from a hospital bed, documenting. At the bottom of the most recent page, she'd written something that wasn't a time or a date. She'd written, I don't want to make trouble, but if this were one of my students, I'd have failed them. I sat down on the edge of her bed and cried in a way I hadn't cried in years. Because that was the whole thing, wasn't it? My mother, who had trained these people, who had built the standard they were failing to meet, was lying there afraid to make trouble. And I understood in that moment that I'd inherited that fear whole, like a family heirloom, and passed exactly none of it on to anyone who deserved it. I made a decision. I was going to make trouble, but I was going to make it correctly, the way she would have, with facts, with dignity, without lies. Not because of who she'd been, but because what happened was wrong, and it would have been wrong for anyone. The next week, I did 3 things. First, I photographed every page of that notebook. Then I asked my mother's permission before doing anything else, because it was her story, not mine, and she was clear-headed and she was entitled to decide. I expected her to wave me off, to tell me to let it go. Instead, she looked at the notebook in my hands for a long moment and she said, "You know what I always told my students? The call light is a promise. When you ignore it, you're not ignoring a bulb. You're telling a frightened person that they're alone." She paused. I taught that for 26 years. I'd like it to still be true. That was her giving me permission. That was Ruth, at 71, from a hospital bed, deciding she was done being background noise. Second, I requested my mother's medical records and the nursing documentation for those shifts, which, as a healthcare proxy, I had the right to do, though it took days and forms and a lot of waiting, because nothing in a hospital is fast. When they came, I compared them to my mother's notebook, and the gaps were damning in their own quiet way. There were charted entries claiming patient checks at times when my mother had written that no one came. Not dramatic falsification, just the ordinary rounding up that happens when someone is behind and needs the chart to say they weren't. A note logged for 8:45 the night of the incident. But I had been in that room at 8:45. No one had been there. Third, and this is where I want to be honest about the part of me that isn't noble. I looked up Wren. Her full name was on the whiteboard each shift. I found her on the hospital's staff directory, and then, because I'm human and I was furious, I found her on social media. I'm not proud of the impulse. But what I found stopped me cold, and it changed the shape of everything. Wren had graduated from a nursing program 3 years earlier, and the program she'd graduated from one of the affiliated programs in the network still used as part of its foundational curriculum, a set of training modules on patient dignity and responsiveness, modules with my mother's name on them, Ruth E. Whitfield. Wren had almost certainly sat in a classroom and studied materials my mother had written about exactly this, about never letting a call light become background noise. She had learned the standard from my mother's own words, and then she had walked past my mother 100 times without ever knowing whose work had shaped her or whose life she was neglecting. I want to tell you I felt triumphant. I didn't. I felt sick. Because the tragedy wasn't that Wren was a monster. It was that she wasn't. She was an ordinary, overwhelmed, checked-out person who had learned the right thing and stopped believing it mattered, the way people do when a system grinds them down. That didn't excuse her, but it complicated the revenge I'd been fantasizing about, and complicated things are always truer than simple ones. Here's where the story could have gone wrong. I could have gone scorched earth. I could have posted the notebook online with Wren's name and photo. It would have gone viral. Nurse ignores dying woman who literally trained nurses. I know how the internet works. It would have destroyed her. And for about a day, I wanted to. I called my best friend Marisol, who has known me since college and who is the only person on earth allowed to tell me the truth to my face. I laid it all out: the notebook, the records, the discovery about the training modules, my plan to burn Wren's life down. Marisol was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Dana, is this about your mom, or is this about every time you swallowed something and let someone walk past you?" I hated her a little for that, which is how I knew she was right. It was both. Of course it was both. And if I did the scorched earth thing, I'd get the sugar rush of it, and then I'd be exactly what I hated: someone who used power to humiliate a person instead of using truth to fix a problem. My mother would have been ashamed of me, not of the anger, of the cheapness. So I chose the harder road. I requested a formal meeting with the hospital's patient safety and nursing leadership. Not a viral post, a meeting. I brought the notebook. I brought the record discrepancies. I brought a written, unemotional summary of the timeline. And I brought one more thing, which I hadn't planned, but which changed the entire room. The night before the meeting, I'd been going through an old box of my mother's things at her house, looking for a document, and I found a folder of letters. Thank you letters, decades of them, from former students, nurses who'd written to Ruth over the years to tell her what her teaching had meant. You told us the call light was a promise, and I've never forgotten it. I think about your voice every shift. One of them, and my hands actually shook when I read the signature, was from Delia, the charge nurse. Delia had been my mother's student 20 years ago and had written her a letter and had not made the connection between room 412 and the woman who had taught her the very standard she'd shrugged off when I first complained. I brought that letter to the meeting. The meeting was in a beige conference room with bad coffee. 4 people from the hospital. Delia was one of them. I laid out the timeline first, plainly. The call light, the 40 minutes, the record discrepancies. I watched them go from defensive to uncomfortable to silent. Hospital administrators have a script for angry family members, and I was giving them nothing to script against because I wasn't yelling. I was just showing them what happened in their own building, in their own documentation. Then, near the end, one of the administrators, kind enough, but reaching for the standard closer, the "we take this very seriously in staffing challenges" speech started in, and I let her finish. And then I put my mother's notebook on the table, open to the page, and I said, I want to tell you who the patient in 412 is. And I told them Ruth Whitfield ran nursing education for this system for 26 years. I slid across the training module, printed, with her name on the byline. I said, some of your current staff were trained on her materials. She wrote the standard your nurse didn't meet. And she wasn't asking for special treatment. She never told anyone who she was, because she believed care shouldn't depend on status. I let that sit. She was right. It shouldn't. Which is exactly why what happened to her is what's happening to patients who can't do what I'm doing right now. And then I slid Delia's letter across the table to Delia. I watched a 20-year-old memory hit a middle-aged woman in real time. Delia picked up the letter. She recognized her own handwriting. She read the top line, and her face just came apart, quietly. She pressed her fingers to her mouth. She said, barely audible, I didn't know it was her. She never said. She wouldn't, I said. That's the whole point. I'm not going to tell you the meeting ended with sweeping justice because that's not how these things work, and I promised you the truth. There was no instant firing. There was no press conference. What there was slower and, I think, more real. There was a formal review. There were changes to the call light response protocol on the floor, an escalation system, so that unanswered lights after a set number of minutes flagged automatically to the charge nurse's device. There was, I later learned, disciplinary action regarding the charting discrepancies, though privacy meant I never got the details, and I decided I didn't need them. Wren was not publicly destroyed. She was, as far as I know, retrained and monitored, and given the chance to become the nurse she'd been taught to be. I made my peace with not controlling that outcome. Controlling it was never really the point. But the thing I didn't expect, the thing that still gets me, happened 3 weeks later. The hospital asked if they could name the revised responsiveness training after my mother. The Whitfield Standard? They wanted to call the call light protocol. They asked me to ask her. I thought she'd say no. I genuinely thought she'd wave it off with that patient, amused look. Instead, when I told her Ruth was quiet for a long time, then she said, the button, Dana, bring me the button. She meant the call button, the one clipped to her bed rail. I handed it to her. She held it in her palm, this small grey thing that had failed her, and she looked at it like it was something precious. And she said, you know, I pressed this thing and I thought after everything I gave them, this is what it comes to. An old woman nobody answers. Her voice caught. I felt so small. She squeezed it. If they name it after me, then every time somebody's afraid to press one of these, and somebody answers, that's me still teaching. That's me not being small. She said yes. My mother came home eventually. She's still here. She's frail, and she has good days and hard days, and she lives with us now. Sophie adores her, and the two of them do crosswords together, which is the best thing I've ever gotten to watch. The garden's too much for Ruth these days, so we do it together, slowly, and she narrates, and I dig. Cole and I are not fully okay, And I want to be honest about that instead of tying a bow on it. When it all came out, the meeting, the notebook, the Standard being renamed Cole showed up warm and proud and told everyone how he'd always known Mom was special. And I felt that old, familiar swallow-it-down reflex kick in, the urge to let him have his version. But I didn't, this time. I told him, privately, quietly, that he hadn't been there, that I'd sat in that chair for 40 minutes alone, that I'd been alone for a lot of things. He got defensive. He said I was rewriting history. We didn't speak for a while. We speak now, carefully. And something has shifted. I no longer arrange myself into the smallest possible shape. So there's room for him. He's had to learn to take up his own space and not mine. It's not a happy ending with Cole. It's an honest one, which I've come to think is better. As for me, the woman who talked herself out of everything, who counted 40 minutes in a hard chair because she was too polite to bang on a nurse's station, she's still in here somewhere. But she's quieter now. Something replaced her, not rage. My mother was right that revenge is a performance. What replaced her was the thing I'd been missing my whole life, the thing I'd handed to everyone else and never kept for myself, the belief that when I press the button, I deserve an answer. I keep my mother's notebook in my desk drawer now, not the photographs, the actual notebook, with her careful shaky handwriting and that line at the bottom. I don't want to make trouble. Sometimes, before a hard conversation I'd normally avoid, I open the drawer and look at it. And then I make the trouble. The right kind. The kind she taught me. The nurse ignored my mother's call button for 40 minutes. She thought she was skipping a tired old woman in a bed. She never found out, not really, who my mother was, the standard bearer, the teacher, the quiet architect of the very promise being broken. But I found out something better. I found out who I was. And I found out that the woman who spent her whole life being background noise raised a daughter who would finally refuse to be. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever sat in a hard chair and swallowed something you should have said, take a second and share what you're carrying in the comments. Sometimes the button just needs one person to answer it.